Alright, hello everyone, welcome back to another video. So today I really want to get into and answer the question of how useful are chess books for improving your games. So for a long time, right, it was considered like if you want to get better at chess, like this is in like the boomer age, right? Like if you want to get better at chess, you got to read chess books. But of course now for like since millennials and for like us Gen Z, it's sort of like it's just normal like to watch videos, buy video courses and sort of learn from them as a way of improving your game. And so sort of the more modern view on things is like, oh, I don't even need books. Like I think even like what, like Pragnananda, like Gukesh, they're like, oh, people still read books sort of thing. And that sort of does get you the question, right? Like if these guys who are like 2700 already, like look at them, right? If they don't read books, like what, why do we need to? So I really do want to talk about this topic a little bit because it's quite interesting, right? And I'll say for myself to start off with, like I really do understand that viewpoint of like why would I even need to read books, because I actually got to like maybe 1900 or 2000 FIDE before even touching a single damn book. And the way I learned was primarily through like playing, solving puzzles on like chess.com or something. I didn't really know what I was doing, to be honest. I had a little bit of coaching, not much, and I did have some courses. I might talk about more in the future what specifically I used, and that definitely did help me a bit. And this sort of experience of mine probably brings me to the first major observation of this video, which is that for most players who like aren't already maybe even like 1600, sort of like what many sort of stronger players would consider an intermediate, we can, you know, debate the terms of intermediate, novice, what rating like you need to be to qualify for each of those. That's a separate discussion, but like let's say 1600, whatever, right? Like in my opinion, for a lot of players who are below that sort of level of 1600, like let's say FIDE or USCF or whatever online equivalent, like I think a lot of the times books are not, the majority of books at least, are not going to be very useful for that sort of audience, but, which is a bit paradoxical because the majority of chess players actually, especially these days, are below that sort of like 1600 threshold. And so a lot of the time when these sort of players are like, what sort of book should I be reading, they're probably asking the wrong question, and that they sort of just need to solve like a bunch of tactical puzzles. They need to learn to not blunder, which isn't as easier said than done, right? And they need to play a lot of games and sort of pick up a lot of the fundamentals, which can only really be learned through playing. But in my opinion, once someone does sort of cross that 1600 whatever like arbitrary threshold where like, you know, you've got down a lot of the basic stuff, you're not like blundering absurd things every game, maybe once in a while you are, but that's just sort of how things are, right? Like from there on, a lot of the stuff you can learn in books, at least in my opinion, becomes a lot more relevant because it's at these sort of points, like you can't just win games by relying on your opponent being a complete buffoon, right? You actually need to sort of be able to outplay them, and that's where learning things from books can come quite in handy. But this is also where you could maybe argue that it's like, well, you can't, well, there are more than just books that you can learn these things from, right? You can watch YouTube videos, you could learn from video courses, these sort of things. And me personally, from when I was like maybe 1800 to like 2000, sort of in that range, that was when I was definitely still not really learning from books very often, and I was still learning a lot from maybe like more you know, videos or video course type material. And while it's definitely possible to get maybe like pretty good off of just, you know, watching that sort of medium of content, I think that in order to really access a lot of this sort of higher level material beyond that, and I understand for a lot of my audience, like maybe this isn't going to be the most relevant thing for you, but maybe you want to just listen through this anyway, like when you do get to that level in the future, which is that, you know, books tend to just be a much more like pure form of chess knowledge, whereas with videos, especially if you're watching them like straight off of YouTube, right, where very often you're getting a very much like watered down, superficial sort of understanding of a certain topic, which, you know, especially if you're a lower rated player, might not necessarily be a bad thing, but as you sort of progress, you're going to find that sort of superficiality letting you down in some ways. And that's where like a good book can sort of serve as a bit of a remedy to that, where very often it's going to cut less corners because it can afford to, like a video that is 30 minutes, it's going to be able to cover maybe a bit more ground than you can read in 30 minutes in a book, at least in terms of like general understanding. But the book, if you really go through it over time, is going to get you a lot further than probably like the videos will. But probably the last general thing I really want to touch on with regards to books, the two sort of different types of books, right? One is generally the books that consist more of trying to build up your knowledge, like those could be famous game collections or just like books in a certain topic, like positional chess, I don't know. And then there are the more puzzle based books, like trying to train your calculation or anything of that sort of nature, right? Or maybe it's also positional, strategic sort of endgame exercises, anything like that, right? And what I want to say about both of these types of books is that, you know, generally those more knowledge-based books, again, like those ones are great. Like I've benefited a lot from those, I think, once I started, you know, reading them, because again, I was already like a somewhat decent player once I started going through them. But the more puzzle-based books, like, okay, there are definitely those can vary in difficulty a lot, but I think there are some, for example, like the 5,000 whatever number of mate in however many moves sort of book, like by Polgar. I'll put a like image up on the screen, you guys probably have heard of that one. Like that's an example of a book which is accessible for players of many different levels. Even stronger title players, I think, have said like some of the more difficult problems in that book gave them a tough time. But at the same time, of course, there are also, I think the majority of the problems in that book are probably more skewed towards players who are a little bit more on the lower side of the rating spectrum. But to sort of wrap the video up, I want to give one concrete example from my own life and chess career, you could call it, of how a certain piece of knowledge may have had the potential to help me at a certain like specific point in like one of my over the board games, where I clearly in this position am a pawn up in a rook endgame. I had the white pieces. I was playing against a stronger player. This is when I still lived in Japan. I was playing against one of the international masters there. So I was outrated by, I think, like 200 or so points. I was around 2100-ish at the time. And unfortunately, I did not manage to convert the advantage because I made the mistake of playing rook d2 when after rook a6. Now, essentially, we have a position where, of course, it looks like white should be able to somehow convert their advantage, but it is very difficult to do so because our rook is really not very mobile due to the fact that it is stuck defending this pawn from black's active rook attacking it. And in the game, I tried to move my king in, of course, very naturally, but you know, he constructed a very clever sort of fortress here with the rook on a4 and the pawn here, where I tried to edge my king in closer, I think, at this point where I played king b6, but I really just couldn't attack the pawn anymore, and I couldn't get my king in like here or anything because his king was guarding against it, and I couldn't use my rook to really attack the pawn because, of course, well, it was busy defending this one. And I was thinking about like maybe pushing these pawns, but at the end of the day I decided not to because again, like if I play something like f4, I'm creating some weaknesses which maybe he could attack with something like maybe king f5 to e4 or maybe like rook a3. And so we ended up sort of getting the draw after like the following moves where I just couldn't come up with anything, and he claimed a threefold repetition in this position. But coming back to the initial position, this is where I wanted to talk about a book I read. This was maybe 2020 or 2021, I can't quite remember. It might have even been late 2019 I read this, which was a book called Learn from the Legends. This is a book, by the way, I'm talking about, Learn from the Legends. This is written by Grandmaster Mihail Marin, one of the best sort of chess writers alive today. He's written a lot of really good books, especially for quality chess. And he had a chapter in that book, by the way, on rook endgames, and he featured a model player, Akiba Rubinstein, who produced in his chess career a lot of really instructive rook endgames. And one of the sort of like rules, let's call it, that Marin like deduced from analyzing these games is sort of like a score concept. You know, in like a soccer game, you might have a score of like 1-0 or like 1-1 or something like that. He sort of devised a similar scoring system where, like in this position, you would sort of by default say that white is 1-0 up because, you know, we have an extra pawn. But after the next following moves, the score all of a sudden becomes 1-1 because rook d2, rook a6. Now we can notice, well, it's not just material that matters. Another very important aspect of rook endgames is also the activity of your rooks, of course. And if we ask whose rook is more active here, well, it's clearly black's because theirs is playing an offensive role while ours is playing a defensive one, which again is sort of what levels the score to 1-1 instead of 1-0 in this position. And at the time, I didn't really have this sort of framework to view the position through, and not that you necessarily sort of need to have that sort of very explicit sort of score or whatever in place, right? But if I did have that sort of understanding, there would have been a much greater chance that instead of playing this very passive move rook d2 in the game, I would have played the more active rook d4 with the intention to meet rook a6 with a4. And now, okay, technically our rook is playing defensive role, but the pawn is up on a much more advanced square, which limits mobility or scope of the black rook on the a file and allows us a lot more easily to bring in our king to like maybe a square like b3 for example, or b4, b5, and continue advancing up the board, where we don't have to worry about continuous, say, checks on the B, C, and A files like we sort of did in the game, because again our pawn was on that more passive square A2. And to show one example from the book which sort of highlighted this to me, this was one of the games of Rubinstein against Lasker, where Rubinstein was 2 pawns up here, and after rook d1 check, a very natural looking move for a lot of players would be to play, well, obviously there's only 2 legal moves, king f2 or rook f1, and a lot of players would by default sort of be like, oh, king f2, rook d2 check, and now they win the b2 pawn, I lose one of my pawns, boo-hoo, I don't want to go for that. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to block the check, and if they go rook d2, well, oh, okay, maybe that's a draw, so maybe I can't go for that. Maybe instead in this position of blocking it again, I go rook b1, hold on to my pawn like this, and I'm hooray, like I'm 2 pawns up, what could be better? But the issue is, again, is that rook activity is extremely important, so yes, while technically you are 2 pawns up, in some sense the score in this position would be 2-1, because okay, you have the 2 pawns, but black has a very active rook, yours is defensive, and not to mention it might even be closer to 2-2 because, well, look at the difference in king activity. Our king is being cut off by the black rook, whereas black's is uninhibited and can get as active as it realistically wants. Which is why in the game, what Rubinstein did was very instructive. Instead of blocking the check, he went for king f2, allowed the fork when king f3, rook takes b2, but now when rook a5, and now, okay, we are a pawn up, but notice how compared to like the other position we looked at, right, just a minute ago, where my rook was playing defensive role, well, now in this one, white's is playing the offensive role, forcing black's rook to play that familiar, like, passive one on the second rank. But not only that, is black's rook much more passive than white's one, but also they're just a pawn down. So if we were to sort of formulate a score perhaps in this position, we would probably say that white is actually 2-0 up compared to this one where it was much more like 2-1 or even perhaps 2-2. But just to show like how the rest of the game unfolded, to just really make it crystal clear to you guys like how terribly bad this is for black, I just want to show how Rubinstein did this. I won't analyze this or give too many comments, but he slowly pushed forward, played a few back and forth moves, and then eventually in this position, Lasker actually resigned because he was basically in Zugzwang at this point. If he pushes the A pawn, it's going to become a lot more loose. If he moves the rook anywhere, like if he moves it off the 2nd or 7th rank, then they're going to get forked by this. If he moves the rook here, e6, and well, if you move it here, again e6, and if the king moves back, well, now at king g6, and you're going to probably get like in some serious trouble along the back rank, or maybe even after this, black is somewhat holding, so maybe it would be a bit more accurate to play a check like this, and perhaps like rook f8, and then only rook f7, and this looks pretty bad. And well, if you can't play any of those moves, well, what's your only option? Well, maybe to move the king like backwards, but then you're going to allow the king to sneak into g6, then give a check and maybe sneak around that way, or if we can just take the pawn like that after the check, that would also do the job. But again, coming full circle, like what was this all about? Like, I didn't want to get too caught up into like the specific moves and necessarily like all of the concrete details and whatnot. It was just this small concept that, you know, I could have implemented in this game had I sort of known about and seen like these practical examples, and isn't too like strategically difficult to grasp. But the problem is I just simply didn't know about it, and because of that, in this game I was in time trouble and I didn't have the time to necessarily think about these things too deeply, and I just thought like I'm a pawn up and I can do whatever I want. But the reality was a lot more complicated, and because of that, instead of beating this international master, I only drew the game. And well, it's life, but obviously I would have preferred to have won the game. But anyways, that is about it for the video. If you guys have any comments, anything, any opinions you have about books yourself, feel free to spread them down in the comment section below. If you like the video, of course, like it, and also subscribe if you like this sort of content. But that's all I have to say for today. Peace out, and hope you guys have a good day.